You're not avoiding because you don't care. You're avoiding because something inside is already full. What if avoidance isn't a flaw in your personality, but a system your mind quietly built to protect itself? Not the dramatic kind of avoidance, not running away, not denial, the subtle kind, putting something off without deciding not to do it, ignoring a task without forgetting it exists, scrolling past a thought you know you'll have to face later. You're not rejecting it, you're just not touching it yet. And that distinction matters. Avoidance is usually framed as weakness, a lack of discipline, a failure of motivation. But what if avoidance is something else? What if it's what happens when the mind is already carrying too much? After too many unfinished decisions, too many open loops, too many things being held quietly in the background. At some point, the system reaches a limit, not a breaking point, a saturation point. And when that happens, the mind doesn't shut down. It filters. Avoidance isn't about not caring. It's about not being able to hold one more thing. So the system starts prioritizing automatically, not by importance, but by survivability. What can wait? What doesn't need attention right now? What can be delayed without immediate consequences? Those things get pushed away, not erased, deferred. That's avoidance. And it often feels confusing because consciously you still care. You know the task matters. You know the decision needs to be made. But something inside resists, not emotionally, systemically. Because adding one more open item feels heavier than leaving it untouched. Avoidance feels passive, but it's not. It's an active response to overload. The mind learns over time that engagement creates more open loops, more tracking, more monitoring, more things that never fully close. So it becomes cautious. It hesitates before opening anything new. This is why avoidance often shows up right after periods of high mental demand, after too many decisions, after too much information, after too much responsibility without closure. Not because you suddenly became lazy, but because the system is full. Avoidance is the mind saying, I can't afford to hold this right now. And because that message isn't conscious, it gets misinterpreted. You tell yourself you're procrastinating, that you should push harder, that you're falling behind. But pushing harder often makes it worse because pushing doesn't close loops, it opens more. So the resistance grows. Avoidance becomes stronger, not weaker, and the cycle deepens. This is where avoidance stops being a moment and becomes a pattern. Not because you lack willpower, but because the system has learned that engagement equals accumulation. Every time you engage, something stays open. So the system protects itself by limiting engagement. It avoids not the effort, but the expansion. This is why avoidance can exist, even when tasks are small. It's not the size of the task that matters. It's what it represents. Another thing to remember, another thing to track, another thing that might not end cleanly. Avoidance isn't fear of difficulty. It's fear of never being done. This is why avoidance often appears around things that don't have clear endings. Open-ended projects, conversations without resolution, decisions that don't come with a finish line. The mind doesn't see these as tasks. It sees them as commitments without boundaries. And commitments without boundaries are expensive. They don't just require time, they require ongoing attention. So the system becomes selective, not because it doesn't care, but because it can't afford to keep everything active at once. Avoidance is the mind quietly saying, if this won't end, I can't let it begin. That hesitation isn't irrational, it's learned. Over time, the system notices patterns. It remembers which kinds of engagement tend to stay open, and it learns to hesitate before repeating them. That hesitation looks like procrastination from the outside, but internally it's something else. It's risk assessment, not emotional risk, cognitive risk. The risk of adding one more unfinished thing to an already full system. So the mind delays starting, because starting means opening, and opening means carrying. This also explains why avoidance doesn't feel relieving. You don't feel relaxed when you avoid something. You feel suspended, because a thing doesn't disappear, it stays present in the background. Avoidance reduces the immediate load, but over time, it makes things heavier. And the system knows this. So avoidance feels conflicted, protective but unsatisfying, necessary but uncomfortable. It's not a solution. It's a compromise, a way to survive a system that never allows closure. This is why advice like just start often fails. Starting doesn't address the real problem. The problem isn't effort, it's accumulation. Until the system believes that engaging will lead to resolution, avoidance will continue. Not as a choice, as a response. So what if avoidance isn't something to fight? What if it's information? A signal that the system is overloaded, that too many things are still open, that the mind has learned it needs to defend its limited capacity. What if the resistance you feel isn't a lack of motivation, but a system trying to prevent one more unfinished thing from being added to the pile? And what if real relief doesn't come from pushing through avoidance, but from creating conditions where things actually end, where choices close, where tasks resolve, where attention is released instead of stored? Because when the system begins to trust that engagement might actually end, avoidance doesn't need to stay as strong. Not because you forced it to stop, but because it's no longer needed.